I'd like to call this meeting to order. People are everywhere. I'm trying my hardest. Okay, I will call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone, to the 6th meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Number one, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by teleconference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Two, for those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. And three, a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. If you're online, use the Zoom hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order to the best of our ability. Please have patience, and we appreciate your understanding in this regard. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 18, 2025, the committee is resuming its study on the government's regulatory reform initiative in agriculture and agri-food. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. Thank you so much for being here, both in person and online. With us today is the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. We have Stephanie Levasseur, Maria Alkid, the National Cattle Feeders Association, joining us in person, Janice Transberg and Kathy Jo Noble. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And we have Salah Zaglimi from the Producteurs de Grains du Québec. Thank you for everyone for joining us. We appreciate your time. All of the witnesses, each group will have 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes. And we'll start with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture.
Bonjour, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I will be speaking in French. I sent my opening remarks ahead of time, so the interpreters should be able to follow what I'm saying. My name is Stephanie Levasseur. I am the second vice president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and I am also an apple grower in the south of Quebec. The CFA is Canada's largest general farm organization, and it represents approximately 190,000 farm families from coast to coast to coast. The discussions we're having here today aim to inform the government's regulatory reform initiative, which seeks to reduce red tape and modernize regulations, which, of course, for us is very important. We have to start this process as quickly as possible. Canada's agricultural and agri-food industry is well rooted in both rural and urban communities across Canada. We contribute almost $150 billion annually to the GDP of the country, and the sector employs 2.3 million people. With a sizable agriculture sector, vast natural resources, and a relatively small population, Canada is well positioned to make agriculture a strategic driver of economic growth. The time is now here for agriculture to become a cornerstone of Canada's future, strategically positioned to boost economic growth, drive innovation, support sustainability and productivity objectives, and improve the standard of living of all Canadians.
Toutefois, les agriculteurs canadiens sont coincés entre
And yet, Canadian farmers are being squeezed between rising input costs, ongoing labor shortages, increasingly frequent and severe climate events, and deepening financial pressures compounded by growing global instability. All of this is happening against a backdrop of declining agricultural productivity growth at a time when the demand for agricultural products and food security concerns has increased. Canadian farmers need access to innovation, new technologies, and pest control products if we are to compete and participate in growing Canada's economy, as we believe we can. We need to streamline and realign our regulatory priorities if we want to make that happen. The first step is to make agriculture a priority, not just for the Agriculture Department, but across the Government of Canada. That is why the CFA recommends that agriculture and agri-food be considered a national priority by amending the Cabinet Directive on Regulation to mandate that government regulations reflect the economic and the competitive interests of Canadian producers and strengthen Canada's food security by ensuring a stable, competitive, and sustainable domestic agriculture and agri-food supply chain. The PMRA and CFIA, as key government regulators that directly impact the availability of pest control products, as well as the labeling, packaging, licensing, certification, and so on of Canadian agriculture and agri-food products, are major actors in this reform. While the functions that they play are critical to maintaining Canada's domestic and international reputation as a supplier of safe, quality agriculture products, decisions are made without sufficient consideration of food security in Canada, nor of the price of food, and even less of the economic impacts of or competitiveness of Canadian agriculture, and this needs to change. In addition, to level the playing field with countries that we trade with, timelines for the regulatory process need to be shortened and efficiency increased. Reevaluations should not take a decade. Evaluating drone usage, for example, for some crops should not take over half a decade. Access to both innovative and existing products and technologies that farmers and producers need to produce the safe food that Canada and the world needs should be prioritized. Right now, Canada is lagging behind other countries in terms of access to much-needed pest control products, feed and additives, emerging technologies, and so on. To accomplish this, the CFA recommends better alignment and collaboration with trusted and like-minded international regulators to harmonize decisions, expedite decision-making, and leverage trusted research work.
Stop you there. It's been a bit over 5 minutes. But you'll have an opportunity to answer questions when they're directed to you. So thank you so much.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, and sorry for interrupting you. And now we'll go to the National Cattle Feeders Association for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The National Cattle Feeders Association is the national voice of cattle feeders. And cattle feeders are beef farmers that bring their calves onto their farms at about the ages of 6 to 12 months. And they modify their diets from grass to high-energy feed to produce more beef and using less resources, resulting in an improved environmental footprint. So the growth of Canada's beef sector is limited by duplicative and unnecessary regulations, and we call on the government to modernize regulatory systems so as to serve as partners rather than obstacles to Canadian farmers. So today we will outline 3 recommendations for regulatory reform. Our first regulation is on labor. There exists a profound and chronic shortage of labor in the agriculture sector. Foreign workers are necessary to maintain and grow our beef sector. The majority of foreign workers hired by cattle feeders are for year-round, long-term jobs, not seasonal. And as a requirement for bringing in these these foreign workers, Canadian employers must first advertise for domestic labor, but to little success. So with no other option available, feedlots bring in employees through the temporary foreign worker program with a goal to move them through the system to permanent residency. But the TFW program is complicated, backlogged, and fraught with unnecessary and unpractical rules and processes. And the main route for permanent residency, which was the agri-food pilot, has recently been canceled, and no other program is in place to replace it. So it's time for the government to build the right foreign worker program for the sectors that have a genuine need and a positive track record, such as the agriculture sector.
Our second recommendation is in regard to the timely approval of innovations. Agriculture is one of the most innovative sectors in Canada, but Canada's approval of innovations take years in what is a cumbersome system that duplicates efforts across departments as well as across global jurisdictions. This creates a scenario where innovations that can deliver sustainable and cost-efficient solutions are available to our global competitors and not Canadian farmers. We propose that Canadian regulators provide provisional registration or approval of products that are already approved in 2 or more trusted global jurisdictions, so that Canadian farmers are not left behind. Thirdly, we recommend a modern Canada-US border process. The Canadian and US beef industries operate within an integrated market, with cattle often crossing the border more than once in their lifetime. As such, regulatory inefficiencies and duplications at the Canada-US border must be addressed. Livestock moving across the Canada-US border in either direction must be inspected by an accredited vet by USDA or CFIA at the origin as well as the destination, and there's further inspection at the border. For cattle coming into Canada, the process is an unnecessary duplication by the CFIA's officials. And the U.S., if Canada and the U.S. accept each other's inspection systems as equivalent, then with technical advancements, there is ample opportunity to improve the process that will reduce government costs, industry costs, and stress on animals. There are also limits at the number of border crossings that have vets to do the inspections. There's limited working hours of the vets, for example, not in evenings or weekends. And these vets are also dealing with domestic animals crossing the border, such as dogs and cats. The result is a negative impact on the flow of commerce, increased wait times that impact both the drivers as well as the welfare of the animals. We've provided 3 specific recommendations in our remarks, but beyond that, we're happy to discuss the need for a transformation of culture, mandate, and reporting structure for the PMRA, CFIA, and VDD. This will catalyze investment in the Canadian agriculture sector. Maintaining food safety standards, consumer confidence, and economic growth can be done at a parallel track.
Thank you. Our final speaker in this segment from the Producteurs de Graines du Québec. You have 5 minutes.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the members of the committee. Thank you for having invited us. We are talking about the effective implementation and management of measures to regulate technologies, biotechnologies, and other strategic agricultural inputs, and this is crucial for the grain sector in Canada and Quebec. Our recommendations in this consultation are aimed at the PMRA and the CFIA. Generally, These government agencies must take food safety and economic and operational impacts, particularly those on farms, and they must take this into account in all their regulatory decisions without compromising health and safety. Health and safety remain paramount, but a balance must be struck between regulating risks and regulating farms' ability to remain competitive and productive. The growth of food production depends on it. Balanced regulation can protect public health while promoting economic growth, competitiveness, and rapid access to innovation. The goal is to maintain the current level of protection, but with approaches that allow the agricultural sector to thrive. More specifically, it is essential that the PMRA draw on the evaluation processes and regulatory best practices of other jurisdictions that are considered reliable and risk-based in order to eliminate duplication and maintain the competitiveness of the agricultural system. Agricultural producers are ready and farmers are ready to adopt modern crop protection technologies. Rapid access to safe and effective products is essential. Regulatory delays and lack of transparency hinder the introduction of new technologies. By drawing on the practices of other countries, Canada can improve its regulatory efficiency without compromising safety. Canada can and must become a global leader in agricultural innovation. This requires sending clear signals to investors. Furthermore, given the modest size of the Canadian pesticide market, regulatory performance must be exemplary to attract innovation. Consequently, it is essential that the PMRA achieve 100% of its regulatory performance targets. Rather than a major transformation, we recommend redirecting resources to core activities to ensure rapid access to innovations. Accelerate the development and full adoption by the CFIA of the Electronic Phytosanitary Certificate Exchange System, ePhyto, for the import and export of grains with international trading partners. Global agricultural trade is rapidly becoming more digital. Canada must fully adopt the ePhyto system to remain competitive. This will reduce costs, improve trade security, and facilitate trade. While progress has been made with Mexico, Canada lags behind the United States and Australia. The United States already exchanges ePhytos with more than 100 countries. More broadly, the grain sector must rely on a reduction in paperwork and red tape. Some of the actions identified by the government are positive, but the overall approach remains far too passive, particularly with regard to the commitment to consider food safety and economic impacts in PMRA decisions, as promised in the Liberal Spring 2025 platform. The sector has long supported improvements to the PMRA's pesticide reevaluation process. The agency has indicated that the workload exceeds its resources. One of the main constraints is the repetition of risk assessments when new data emerges after proposed decisions are published. It is concerning that each year, the number of applications for new product registrations submitted to the PMRA has decreased by half compared to 10 years ago, and approval times have nearly doubled. This significantly disadvantages Canadian agriculture and undermines its competitiveness. Given that it takes an average of about 12 years for a new crop protection product to reach the market, farmers can face devastating losses caused by pests. In addition, the PMRA had promised to consult with agricultural groups more frequently. We consider this essential to avoid major changes after decisions are published.
You've exceeded the 5 minutes. We'll start with the Conservatives for 6 minutes. John?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks again to our witnesses for being here. And you can certainly sense the frustration on some of the witnesses having to deal with these agencies. Ms. Lavaseur, I want to start with you, and I believe you said you were an apple grower. Is that correct? We've had the recent decision with Dacamba from PMRA, which is very similar to what agriculture went through with the Lambda Psi decision a year ago. This was devastating impact on apple growers specifically. It seems like we're having this happen yet again, where PMRA is making a decision on a label change before the science is even complete on that potential change. And we know PMRA made a mistake when it came to the difference between animal feed and the food system. What impact did that change, that potential label change on Lambda Psi and banning the use of Lambda Psi have on your apple orchard? And maybe talk about the impact it had on your CFA members.
Well, I may not be able to talk directly about that particular product, but the history has repeated itself many times over in the past, I'd say 5 or 6 years, where PMRA has been trying to recuperate lost time because they hadn't been doing their reevaluations in proper timely fashion, and they're kind of speeding it up to get back on track. But as you say, they do not always they don't take into consideration the fact that there's no alternative. It doesn't enter in their equation. So for them, if it's only a question of assessing risk to health and nature, and they don't really have any inclination to take into account what effect it has on the growers or producers.
Thank you. I just have a limited time, so I just want to go to my next question. And again, it's to CFA. The Prime Minister made a commitment in his election platform that there would be a mandate change to CFA and PMRA to include food security and economic impact in their decisions, which is exactly what you are alluding to. However, when we had the officials here a couple of weeks ago and asked them that question, do you have a timeline to act on this mandate change? The response from the CFA and the PMRA was, we have no reason to change the way we do business. As representing one of the largest agriculture groups in the country, what would be your response to that answer from the officials from CFI and PMRA that they have no intentions of acting on those mandate changes and the promise in the Liberal platform?
It's kind of disheartening, really, and it illustrates well the lack of coherence that we've been living with government regulations. Sometimes the left hand says the opposite of what the right hand says, and this is a perfect example. I mean, if the mandate is there, these agencies should comply and work with us to be able to achieve what the Prime Minister is asking of them without putting into peril any, security of the public or the safety of our food supply. But we do need to stay competitive, and we do need for them to accelerate the process to keep our toolbox replenished.
And one quick question, just a yes or no, if that's okay. The CFIA has put out their red tape reduction report. Was CFIA offered a formal consultation as part of that process? We have heard that they were asked, agriculture groups were asked not to participate. Do you know if you were allowed or was there a formal consultation, yes or no?
No, we were not invited.
Thank you. I wanted to go to the cattle feeders. And after a number of studies that have happened and I want to get my dates correct here, some follow-up by AFC conducted over the last 2018, 2019, 2020, an assessment of the new rest stop hours of animal transportation. Has now been shown that there's no scientific reason to be making these changes. Would you expect that Transport Canada and CFIA would now reverse these changes and allow you to go back to the system that was working well for decades? And maybe, Janice or Kathy Jo, maybe a little bit of assessment what these changes, the impact it's having on the industry in terms of unloading and loading cattle.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So the biggest challenge is lameness. So when you take cattle on and off a truck, you cause lameness. Some of the concerns I think that they were addressing were more the public concerns of food and water. Were these animals getting sufficient amounts of food and water? We did, when they were bringing these recommendations forward, they were actually in the process of doing some research that they had funded to find out what would be the impact of the length of time. And so we did request that they pause until the science was there to make the changes, but the changes were made as you suggested. So now that the research has come out and is public and is shown that that there is more harm to loading and offloading, we haven't seen any changes coming forward. And some of the complications are, for example, if you're driving a truck all the way across from Alberta, let's say, to Ontario, and let's say you get hit by a snowstorm, that we just had snow in Alberta, something gets delayed, all of a sudden now you have to find a spot, you have to offload those cattle and bring them back on. So that is increasing the risk.
Much. Now we'll move to the Liberals for 6 minutes. MP Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. We've heard witness testimony over and over again that the duplication of regulatory burden is their biggest frustration. So where would be the cutting of red tape have the biggest impact on your sector?
Well, there's a number, but if I just go to one of the examples that we provided on the border services, so as a truck gets inspected and it gets a seal that's put on it, so a seal meaning literally it seals the truck. So the animals have been run through a chute, they've been shown to be healthy, all the numbers match up, they go on the truck is sealed. Now you get to the border coming from the US to Canada, and that's done by a USDA vet. Now you're at the Canadian border and you have to wait for a vet. So you have to time your truck to get through when the vets are actually there. And not only that, the vets are also looking after cats and dogs and other things that are crossing the border. So now you have this load of animals that are sitting on the truck, getting over the time that they're allowed to be on the truck, getting over the time that the trucker is allowed to be driving. So then they have to go through their vet inspection. Then when they get to their destination, again, within 48 hours, the animals are offloaded. They're kept in a separate pen. They cannot mingle. And a CFIA-accredited vet has to come and inspect all the cattle. So in my mind, that's a complete duplication of CFIA vets. If we didn't have that, if we trained our CSBA agents to just go through the paperwork, make sure everything's okay, I think that would be a good savings, and it would also help with transport and commerce.
I think it's particularly important for cattle feeders because we're transporting live animals. So as much as we support the diversification away from the U.S., we have live animals, and you can't transport live animals easily in the volumes we're sending them down to the U.S. It has to be that Canada-U.S. relationship.
Thank you. When the truck arrives and there is no vet available, is there a time limit, or what happens, and how long are people potentially waiting?
So when the truck arrives in Canada, as I said, the cattle do get offloaded, and they have to be in a pen that is just specific to those animals. They can't mingle with any other animals, and a vet has to be there within 48 to 72 hours. So I think that's less of the concern because we have our relationships with our vets in each provinces. It's more that it's at the border. What is the need when it's been sealed at one end, can't be opened until it gets to the other end? So that seal remains on there. What is the need to have that vet at the border?
You spoke a little bit about some innovations that you would like to see move forward. Could you speak more to the innovations that you would like to see approved?
So there's something that's called a ultra high frequency tag, And this is all animals get tagged, and this allows someone to literally pass by with a wand and be able to pick up every single tag that's on that truck. And this technology is being used in the United States. We've piloted it in Canada, but it's not used in Canada yet. So that's just one example. There's other examples of technologies coming up, but that would be, again, at the border, an easy way to make sure that the cattle that are on the truck match all the paperwork that they have in front of them.
Thank you. Another question for you. So we spoke a little bit in the summer about the concern about interprovincial trade barriers. So I was wondering if you'd like to have this opportunity to speak more about your concerns when it comes to interprovincial trade barriers and the provincial regulations and the federal regulations when it comes to export.
Do you want to take that?
Sure. And I think I've shared with most of you our comments in written format, but the concern is that in the provincial abattoirs, there's different levels of rules and regulations, and we are concerned because we have arrangement with our global partners that the product they're receiving is up to a federally regulated standard, and we need to ensure that they feel confident that they're still receiving product that comes up to that federally regulated standard to access our global markets. And the second challenge is we are able to import meat, but it has to meet our federally regulated rules of how it's processed in another country. And so if you bring that low common denominator down, then it's hard to say you cannot have product coming into our country, beef product coming into our country from a country or a plant that has lower standards than federally, because we're accepting that movement across the province of that lower standard. We think that it feels rushed. We have concerns, industry has concerns, and we really recommend that this is one that's set aside to do some due diligence to see that it isn't going to impact our access globally, and that we're able to protect our own markets as well of what's coming in.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly add as well? I mean, one of the solutions might be to help bring everybody up to CFI, to our federal standards. But as well, some of those local abattoirs are really necessary, so it shouldn't be mandatory.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. We appreciate it. Ms. Levasseur, I'll start with you. You mentioned the drones that we've spoken about in the previous meetings in this committee. We are all wondering how a product can be approved for use by plane but not by plane. We all know that the doses are smaller and it's lower, but we still want to know why there's a holdup there. There's a lot of things that we've mentioned multiple times. We can keep talking about them, but we want to know what your recommendations would be for the CFIA in order to modify their processes. Do you have any examples that you can give us that would demonstrate, a step that can be removed in order to expedite things? Is it a question of resources? Is it inefficiency? Is it bad will? What's the issue here?
Monsieur Perron.
Thank you, Mr. Perron. I wouldn't say that it's bad faith. I wouldn't go that far. It's often the reaction we have when we don't know, when we have uncertainty, when we're faced with uncertainty. But there are some trials all over the world. I don't have a specific answer for you today. Perhaps you can communicate with industry actors who actually use or want to use those products. There are certain things that are used as pesticides for soil and so on. Drones are very useful in various different applications. As you say, I think that drones are less risky than planes. If we can apply or spray pesticides by plane, then there are less products that we can use, actually. The drone allows us to spray the pesticide more with more precision. So it should actually be a lot simpler for us to approve the spraying of pesticides by Prone. If you do have any examples or specific recommendations that you can provide in writing, that would be great. This is true for all of the witnesses. If there's anything that you would like to share in writing, that would be great. I'd like to talk about the emergency certification that fruit and vegetable growers in Quebec have brought up. Sometimes there is an emergency request for certification because of a disease or a pest that is damaging the crops. The product is eventually approved, but by the time it's approved, the crisis is come and gone. How can we expedite this process? We'd like to have some very precise recommendations that we can transmit. What can you share? We can give you some stuff in writing, but these are not things that they're completely unknown. These products are known, and usually the requests are made 1 year, every year, because the certification takes too long. Emergency certification is usually for molecules that we've already made requests for. There could be very, very long. There can be a list of products that we can fast track that, was used a previous year, and perhaps why not reuse it the following year. I think there's a way of managing these requests in order, especially when there is a repeated request, because we are waiting on, a more standard or regular certification. Thank you. Some scientists of the Quebec government had recommended some products, but it had not been tested federally, and so they chose some products that had not really been certified in Quebec either. So perhaps there's some sort of method in order to share various data. I would like to hear Mr. Zolemi on this, especially with regards to seed. With regards to emergency certification, our sector is not impacted as much because it's not the same production cycle. It's shorter, and we don't have as many issues with pests. However, there is the issue of drones that you mentioned earlier. This is a request that's been made over and over again for a long time, and it's been made across the world in various countries. It's a very specific request. Here's an example. Sometimes pests or weeds that are in a crop and they're concentrated and inaccessible with certain machines. So either you get rid of the entire crop or don't do anything. With a drone, you can actually get to that area with very specific GPS coordinates in order to target the problem area. And that means the risks are reduced. The certification process is taking far too long, and so many producers use the drones for various applications, but they want it also for pesticide application. You also talked about e-phytos. I might not have time to ask you a specific question, but maybe you can provide some information in writing.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go around for 5 minutes with the concerns. Mr. Gourde.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma première question va être...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question is for the Quebec seed producers or seed farmers. You are impacted by a very the price. The price of grain or of seeds are lowering, but the inputs are increasingly expensive. There are certain products that are that have a 35% tariff. They're nitrogen-based products. Is that tariff still in place? I have to double check. I'll have to see if there's an update and send you the information. I believe that during the first year, there was a refund for farmers, but are those costs, is the extra profit in the government's coffers? Where is that? A part of that tax was put into a climate fund for agriculture. It wasn't on an individual basis. So the funds were not allocated to various farmers. There are less returns than if there were a collective program. Per hectare for production for a crop like corn, what does that tariff represent? I don't have the exact number of how much that costs, but the cost of production has a certain percentage increase. So the production costs are increased. So farmers have a positive margin or rather negative? This year it was negative. Next question is for the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. I talked about tariffs, but it also impacts dairy farmers, cattle farmers, as they have a lot of hay as well. But they also use nitrogen-based fertilizer, and those are tariffed at 35%. What can be done here? Those tariffs are political decisions. Of course, they impact all producers and farmers who need those products. Unfortunately, we don't have many alternative sources. We have to buy the products that have tariffs imposed on them. We can't necessarily either use other products, entirely different ones. There are issues in various agricultural sectors that have, whether they be seed or vegetable farmers, but I don't have the exact numbers. I actually am very concerned about the percentage of farmers. They're 1% of the Canadian population, and it's decreasing. Have we reached a critical level? We have an obligation there is an obligation to hire temporary foreign workers, but that very small percentage of workers is feeding a very large amount, a high number of Canadians. Is this number still going to decrease over the next 15 minutes? I hope not. I believe food security will be compromised if that happens. On the day we'll need to rely on temporary foreign workers in order to import food. I think that actually the prices might decrease because there will be less competition here. I think that the production will not decline to that rate. Some farms are growing. There are less and less relatives who are willing to take over the farm. Parents have less children as well, and so they don't have as many children in order to pass on the farm, and they might be interested in something else. What's more worrying this year is that the net revenue has been decreasing, and we've been talking about this for the past 3 or 4 years. There are very concerning decreases. In Quebec, for the first time, the revenue will be actually in the negative for the first time.
Sorry. Okay, next we'll go to MP Dandurand with the Liberals for 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you for being here and for sharing your knowledge and your experience within this field. I'll start with the Quebec seed producers. We talked about tariffs on inputs and production costs. There was a very difficult season with regards to climate events in Quebec. What is the impact on extreme environmental events, which are happening successively, versus the impact of tariffs on nitrogen fertilizer? Which is hurting farmers and producers the most? Of course, both hurt. It kind of depends on the crop and how the crop was impacted by climate change. Climate conditions were very harsh. Some crops were completely abandoned. There are people who lost almost in entire fields, and some just had a lot less profitability. So the impact was very negative this year, and it is becoming a cyclical issue. One of the issues is that there's a fertilizer tax, and it is a restriction that the producer has to live with. And that, of course, diminishes the net revenue while increasing the input costs without actually having much of a punctual impact. That long-term tax, of course, engenders lower revenues. The other issue is more punctual, so it is difficult to say which one is more impactful. It really depends on, maybe a region that is more impacted by climate change, for example. Were markets able to look towards companies or countries that don't have any tariffs? We don't have much choice. Technically, those who deliver to Canada or who deliver inputs to Canada are not, plentiful. There was some nitrogen fertilizer coming in from the United States and from Russia, but they also have their own needs. There's definitely a dearth that, increases prices. Does that make management practices, is there any positive impact to this and whatever is happening right now? Yes, there are very many changes. Producers are adapting in order to adopt better practices. Of course, farmers are putting a lot of effort. Those best practices can be beneficial, but it takes more than 1 or 2 years then to see a positive impact. In order to increase the organic matter by 1% of soil, then it takes 90 years. So it can take a long time. Thank you for that summary. In your opening remarks, you talked about changing basic activities, and you talked about the PMRA. What are their fundamental activities, and what should we be changing? I'll take 1 or 2 examples. Our organization talked about post-market products. There were supplementary costs. The main mission of the PMRA is the certification of products, the risk assessment for certification. Having this, different sector meant that it meant increased costs for producers and those who had the products as well. So they should be focused more on product certification.
Next, we'll go to Mr. Perron for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Zaglami, perhaps you want to, finish those thoughts because that was quite interesting. Which thoughts on that duplicated process? I can add some details. The duplication happens with what's happening in the U.S. It's a relatively similar system. It would be great not to start over a process that has already started. It might be necessary to prioritize versus with the needs of producers and their phytosanitary products. It doesn't mean that we have to cut into the risk assessment, but just take what's most important, what's crucial and what's important. You have to make a distinction between the two. Thank you. Ms. Tronberg and Ms. Noble, I'd like to talk to you about the slaughterhouses. You talked about slaughterhouses that are federal and those that are, more localized. Is there any way to standardize things and make them more equitable? I'm talking about inspection costs, federal inspection costs. What can we do as a government?
So as we mentioned, one of the possible solutions would be to help some of the more provincial abattoirs come up to CFIA standards. But you also have to understand that that means having vets on hand. So that's number one, we already have a shortage of CFIA vets, so we would have to train more vets. And then there's a cost to that. So so I think that is a possible solution. But again, you also have to remember that, as we mentioned, some of those local abattoirs are very necessary. People use them. They don't necessarily have to be to federal standards. So I think the complication is, how do you ensure that we make sure food safety is there and that we don't impact our export trade markets, but allow both provincial and federal abattoirs to coexist. So we're just saying that there has to be consideration around interprovincial trade of red meat, and you have to think about those things and how are we going to ensure that happens. The other option as well is province-to-province agreements.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our witnesses joining us here today. We appreciate your time, and we'll suspend for 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello. Just a couple of comments before we start. Please, if you are speaking, please wait until you're recognized by myself. If you're on video conference, click the microphone icon to activate your mic. And a reminder that we're here pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by committee on Thursday, September 18th, 2025. We have three witnesses joining us here today. Pulse Canada, Greg Northey, Seeds Canada, Brent Collin, and Soy Canada, Brian Innes. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We welcome your input, and we'll start for a 5-minute presentation by Pulse Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Greg Northey, and I am here on behalf of Pulse Canada, representing over 26,000 growers and more than 100 processors and exporters of peas, lentils, beans, and chickpeas. Canada accounts for close to 1/3 of the global pulse trade, and upwards of 85% of what we produce is exported. The pulse sector is resilient, and we are committed to our role as a trusted supplier of high-quality food for the world. But to continue to compete globally and ensure Canada is the preferred supplier to the world's top markets, we need government to champion a domestic regulatory policy that removes unnecessary barriers to our competitiveness. For many years, Pulse Canada has engaged deeply in Canada's regulatory reform efforts, participating in consultations, responding to Canada Gazette proposals, and submitting detailed recommendations. Across all of that work, our purpose has remained the same: to build a regulatory environment that continues to protect health and safety while also enabling innovation, investment, and trade. Successive governments have recognized the need for reform. Efforts such as the Smart Regulation Agenda of the early 2000s, the Red Tape Reduction Action Plan in 2012, the Red Tape Reduction Act of 2015, and the current 2025 Red Tape Review all acknowledge that outdated rules create unnecessary costs, slow innovation, and limit competitiveness. Yet despite decades of reviews and commitments to many of the barriers we identified 10 or 20 years ago still exist today. That reality matters because Canada's future as a global agri-food leader depends not only on what we grow, but on how quickly and effectively we can bring new products to market, adapt to evolving consumer demands, and respond to new technologies and trade opportunities. Achieving that requires a regulatory system that is agile, aligned with our trading partners, and focused on enabling growth, not one constrained by excessive risk aversion and institutional inertia. 3 examples illustrate why the shift is urgently needed. First, protein content claims. We've been calling for reform of Canada's outdated protein labeling framework for many years. Canada and the United States remain the only countries that require a protein quality test before a food can make a protein content claim. As a result, staple pulse products like beans, lentils, peas, foods that Canada's own food guide calls protein-rich, cannot say so on their labels. We've recommended adopting internationally accepted approaches and ultimately moving towards a simpler, quantity-based approach used in the EU and Australia. Yet despite repeated submissions and years of discussion, Health Canada's September 2025 Red Tape Reduction Update does not mention protein claims. The overall language is positive in it, alignment, quote-unquote flexibility, but there is no action, no timeline, no measurable outcome. This is emblematic of a broader pattern: ambition without accountability, and regulatory caution that continues to hold innovation back. Second, CFIA's adoption of electronic phytosanitary certificates. For more than a decade, exporters, including Pulse Canada, have urged CFIA to adopt full electronic phytosanitary certification, or ePhytos, to streamline trade documentation. CFIA began exploring this in 2018 or even earlier. In recent months, we've seen a potential ePhyto project being developed for this fall to Mexico, but after more than a decade, this is still a partial step. Third, the PMRA. The recent Red Tape review of the Pest Management Regulatory Agency underscores the same pattern we see elsewhere. Long-standing issues are acknowledged, but meaningful progress remains distant. Joint reviews with international partners, for example, are an important tool, but PMRA has been discussing expanded joint review processes since at least 2008. While plans to broaden these reviews to more partners and risk areas are included in the latest update, timelines now stretch to 2027 and beyond, far too slow when Canadian farmers are competing today against producers in jurisdictions that already have access to these tools. These examples reflect a system that remains reactive rather than proactive, adjusting course only when pressured rather than anticipating industry needs and enabling innovation before problems arise. They also reflect a broader challenge across Canada's regulatory landscape, one of excessive risk aversion, that too often prioritizes avoiding mistakes over seizing opportunities to deliver real economic and competitive gains. Canada's agriculture and agri-food sector is ready to lead in innovation and sustainability and in supplying the world with high-quality plant-based food. But that will only happen if government embraces a new mindset, one that sees competitiveness and innovation as core regulatory outcomes, and one that measures success by results, not reports. Pulse Canada and our members are ready to partner with government to achieve that shift, but the time has come to move from ambition to action, and finally to build a regulatory system that is fit for the future. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. It was perfect timing. Next, we'll go to Seeds Canada. Brent Collins.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Brent Collins, President of Seeds Canada, the national association representing seed developers, growers, analysts, retailers, and service providers across the country. I also serve as the head of Seeds and Traits for BASF Agricultural Solutions Canada, a Seeds Canada member. I'm here today to support your study on regulatory reform in agriculture and agri-food, and to provide factual, impartial insights. For any questions beyond my expertise, I will most certainly follow up with information to be provided. Seed is the foundation of Canada's $112 billion agri-food industry. Our sector contributes $6 billion annually to the economy, 63,000 jobs, and $700 million in both imports and exports each year. To unlock the full potential of Canadian agriculture, we must modernize the regulations and institutions that govern seed development and commercialization. The current framework is outdated, overly complex, and burdened by red tape. It does not reflect today's realities of rapid innovation, climate change, and global competition. Modern, efficient regulations are essential to ensure Canadian farmers have timely access to high-quality seed and the latest genetic innovations, ideally ahead of our international competitors. Regulatory burden must be reduced, and risk management must be balanced with cost and speed to market. This is especially important in the current environment with trade wars challenging farmers' markets and depressed commodity prices. The seed sector is primarily regulated under the Seeds Act and regulations, administered by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the CFIA. This framework was originally developed in the early 1900s and remains mostly the same today. The agricultural landscape of today versus when the legislation was developed share little in common. At that time, wheat was king, canola didn't exist, and farms ran on manual or animal labor. The regulations have been under review through the CFIA's Seed Regulatory Modernization Initiative, a 5-year process involving extensive stakeholder engagement. Seeds Canada has been an active participant throughout, including the most recent consultation that closed on October the 3rd. We welcome some of the proposals in the CFIA's policy paper, such as incorporating regulations by reference and recognizing an external advisory committee. But overall, the changes fall short of the transformative modernization that was promised. Given the time and resources committed to this process, the proposals fall short of meaningful change, and in some cases will increase seed cost and discourage adoption of innovation by farmers. The advisory committee, a concept included in the policy document and originally proposed by Seeds Canada in 2022, must be more than symbolic. It should be a strong, inclusive body with the authority to guide regulatory amendments, standard setting, and policy development. We are also concerned that many proposals are framed as explorations rather than concrete reforms. After 5 years of consultation, further deferral risks stagnation. For example, delaying the expansion of first-party seed crop inspection is a missed opportunity to improve efficiency and to reduce costs. The proposed shift toward alternative service delivery models with a single service provider requires scrutiny. The recent removal of CFIA's alternative service delivery policy from its website, just as third-party delivery of critical services is being proposed, raises concerns about transparency and potential cost impacts for farmers and seed companies. Similarly, we were disappointed with CFIA's progress report on red tape reduction. The proposed actions are unlikely to meaningfully improve farmers' access to innovation. True modernization must be guided by three principles: transparency, efficiency, and collaboration. We urge the government to do three things. Firstly, to establish a formal role for the advisory committee. Secondly, to commit to clear timelines for implementing further reforms. And thirdly, to ensure regulatory changes improve seed access and reduce costs for farmers.
Sir, I'm going to have to stop you there. I gave you an extra 15 seconds to finish the 3 points. Next, for 5 minutes, Mr. Innes. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Oui, je suis désolé, je dois faire un appel au règlement quand même. Que les interprètes ont mentionné au
Point of order, because it was mentioned at the very beginning of the gentleman's opening remarks that the sound had not been approved for interpretation. If I understand correctly, we may not actually be able to get the answers to our questions live. He will have to submit them by in written format, and the interpreters are signaling to me that this is correct. The sound is not adequate for the interpreters and can damage their health.
Thank you. Our team is trying to reach him. Mr. Collins, apparently your sound is not at the standard for the House of Commons. What we're going to do is you can submit your presentation. In regards to questions, we will not be able to ask you questions. Is that correct? We will not be able to ask you questions because of the sound quality. But we'll follow up with you. But you can stay on and listen in. But we won't be able to do that. Mr. Perreault?
I would humbly suggest that, well, for example, the witness to take time out of his day to be here with us. Perhaps the other members of the committee can send him or ask him questions, and maybe if he can't answer because of the sound quality, he can still submit his answers in written format. I think that this is a good way of respecting the witness's time and also respecting official languages.
Okay, I think that's actually a good idea. So, Mr. Collins, you can stay on. And if there are questions, it's up to you. But if there are questions, they can direct them to you, but don't answer them. You can submit the questions back to the committee officially. Just jot them down, and we'll be able to add those into our report. Did you have your hand up? No?
Monsieur le Président, c'était pour faire le même point.
I actually wanted to make the very same point that my colleague made.
Okay, excellent. So I think we're good. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Mr. Collins, for your understanding, and
thank you.
Please stay on. Mr. Innes, 5-minute presentation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. A regulatory system that does not impose unnecessary burden is important to our international competitiveness. Your study is very timely because there's many things facing our industry from abroad. But yet, what we do here in Canada to enable our competitiveness is completely within our control. I'm here representing the soybean value chain. Soy Canada brings together members from across the value chain, including our seed developers, our farmers, our processors, and exporters, from the Atlantic all the way to the Rockies. We are the third most valuable crop in Canada, and we produce world-leading food-grade soybeans to produce soy milk and tofu and miso, as well as commodity beans to process into animal feed, as well as oil for humans and biofuel. Avec plus de 70% de notre production,
with over 70% of our production meant for export, we have been focusing our efforts on international or global markets and what our sector needs to be competitive. I'd like to highlight 3 areas where action and direction could make a real difference for our sector. First, the committee recommend the PMRA consider food security and economic impacts in their regulatory decisions without compromising on health and safety. This is important because it would lead to processes and decisions that deliver better outcomes for farmers while upholding health and safety. There are many voices in the conversation about regulating crop protection products and phytosanitary products, but ultimately we need to think about why we need these products in the first place: food security and competitiveness.
Sector, we're living a real example of how this renewed focus would create real benefits. The recent proposed decision to remove all post-emergent uses of dicamba herbicide on soybeans would take away a valuable tool for our farmers. But if food security and economic impact were priorities, the PMRA could consider this crop protection tool has real value for farmers to control weeds resistant to other herbicides. And there would be an ability to consider that the most valuable and practical time to use this tool is when the soybean crop emerges, after the soybean crop emerges. This is the very use that the proposed decision is set to take away. So how was removing the most valuable use pattern considered by the PMRA? Secondly, that the committee recommend the CFIA's ongoing seed regulatory modernization effort must not make processes slower or more expensive. Nous constatons un risque réel de rendre le processus d'inscription.
We realize that there is a real risk of the process to list soybean varieties becoming slower and more expensive. For food-grade soybeans, the Canadian Seed Growers Association currently provides a variety listing service that processes applications within a few days. In the penultimate CFIA proposal last month, it recommends that the CFIA take over this process.
That this will mean a slower and costlier registration process for our soybeans. Lastly, the committee recommend that the CFIA expedite the rollout of electronic phytosanitary certificates. Canada is an international laggard in electronic documentation, significantly behind our U.S. competitors who can use these electronic phytosanitary certificates for more than 100 countries. This frustrates our customers and imposes cost on our sector that our competitors just do not have. For example, consider our soybean exports to Japan, where almost 3,000 paper phytosanitary certificates are required. It creates extra burden in time and in courier costs, and we estimate these costs to be about $1 million per year just for our soybeans to Japan. There are also added risks and costs with financing that come with that. It's a self-imposed cost in Canada that's hurting our competitiveness and frustrating our competitors. It's embarrassing to have our customers repeatedly ask why we can't do this. We sent emails 30 years ago, and today we send 3,000 paper copies of phytosanitary certificates to Japan. Nous devons faire mieux, et le comité a un rôle essentiel.
We must do better, and the committee has an essential role in order to encourage and foster change.
And how your political leadership can have a real impact on improving the regulatory environment and our competitiveness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Innes. We appreciate your testimony. And now we'll go to the Conservatives for 6 minutes. Mr. Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. I'm going to ask each of the three witnesses, so Mr. Collins, I would welcome your response in writing to the following question in the order that they testified. So Pulse Canada and then Soy Canada. Quote, it should take 2 to 4 years to review the safety of a pesticide, end quote, and that comes from Robert Arneson in Crop Management News. PMRA began looking at the health and environmental safety of Liberty, whose active ingredient is glufosinate ammonium, in 2018, and it expects to complete the review in 2027. Yes, 2027, that's 9 years. PMRA is allowing present uses to continue as it goes through the reevaluation process, but will not allow new uses. BASF's InVigor canola hybrids, who have a tolerance for Liberty, therefore cannot receive registration to be used as they're considered a new product. Glyphosate has been used in Canada for 30 years, and there are no known cases of harm to humans when applied with label instructions. By the way, the BASF Liberty Link canola system was launched in Australia in 2021. With respect to canola, we compete with Australia in the Indo-Pacific, which is a focus of this government's attempts to expand our agri-food exports through the new office we have in Manila, and I was just in that region 3 weeks ago promoting those same exports. So here's my question to all of you. In your specific sectors, do you have any products that the Canadian industry does not have access to because of the extremely slow processes at PMRA? Please, Mr. Northey.
So there's not any specific product that comes to mind, but as a Pulse farmer, as a farmer of all other crops, these kind of issues are a problem, obviously, and I don't think it's clearly not acceptable. And I think, as we noted in our opening testimony, whenever we see these kind of reports from our regulatory agencies, like we saw in September, when they talk about ambition and they have the correct words, and we're not seeing the action, it's a problem. I think the question around drones is a really good one, where in the U.S., their farmers have access to drones right now. While they conduct their reviews, PMRA, we haven't been able to get there. And so ultimately, these are always the issues we face with our regulatory agencies, and we've faced it for many years.
Go to Mr. Innes, a solution. What would be, from your industry's perspective, a solution to get past the announcements and get actually to the action?
Yeah, and I think you've heard testimony in the past few days, and even Mr. Innes reflected it as well, is what kind of mandate change would be required at agencies, where obviously they're respecting the health and safety of Canadians for sure, but what would it look like if they took into account different aspects within their mandate that would focus on the kind of things we're talking about, whether it's competitiveness, whether it's the things that our farmers need and our industry needs. And we've talked about it for many years, but that's ultimately what would drive change.
You mentioned the mandate change. That was in the Liberal election platform, and yet we've heard testimony at this committee by both agencies that their mandates do not need to be changed. Do you agree?
No, they do need to be changed.
Thank you. I'll shift to Mr. Innes, please. Any other products that the industry, the soy industry, does not have access to in Canada vis-a-vis our partners, our competitors, I should say?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The example I cited in my opening remarks could be a real example of exactly what you're talking about, where American farmers would have access to this herbicide, dicamba, and if the proposed decision from the PMRA becomes final, that would mean that our Canadian farmers would not have access to that herbicide. It's a really significant impact when you think about how farmers need to manage resistant weeds, whether we're talking about kochia in Western Canada, or whether we're talking about water hemp or fleabane or ragweed. All of these weeds are resistant to herbicides, and our farmers look for ways to manage their crop and to create the best yields they can. When you take away tools, and certainly tools relative to the other folks who are able to produce just miles away, that has a real impact on our sector and eroding our competitiveness.
Comment on the need for a mandate change or not by both of the agencies that we're studying?
The really important part is that there is direction to the agencies to consider economic competitiveness, as well as how they can think about economic impacts. And whether it's a mandate change or whether it's direction that then gets implemented in policies, there are many options and ways it can be done, but there needs to be a change in how they do business.
Thank you. And Mr. Collins, I would welcome your comments on both of those questions. In August of 2025, Food and Beverage Canada testified to the Committee on Finance that the federal government should conduct a reverse burden of proof with respect to regulations and the elimination of regulations. What would be your comment? We've also heard testimony that we should have harmonizations. There's two trusted partners that have done the review process for either reevaluation or the certification of new active ingredients. Mr. Northey, what would your comments be?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, right now we have a one-for-one rule in Canada, and ultimately they look at administrative burden. But the reality is that while the administrative burden is one piece, the whole the cumulative burden of all the regulations is what impacts the sector. So if a new regulation comes in, even if it's a modernized regulation, the ability for that regulated party to understand the regulation, how it's rolled out, the interpretation, it's the full burden. So whether it's a reverse, as you say, what was suggested, or whether it's just a better focus on the economic impact, on the cumulative burden of regulation, all ideas should be on the table.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go to the Liberals for 6 minutes. MP Chatel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here with us. Thank you, Mr. Ennis, for mentioning how important it is that we work on this, that the committee work on this study. Indeed, this new Liberal government really wants to reduce red tape. We want to make sure that we have a modern regulatory system. And as mentioned by Mr. Nothley, it is the accumulation of regulations that is problematic. Maybe each and every one of them is valid, but it's the accumulation that is burdensome. So we are undergoing a review, and I think that this is a good first step that has been made by your agencies. The committee's ambition is to ask them to go even further, partly by hearing what you, the experts, have to say. With regards to the mandate, I worry about simply changing the mandate and thinking everything will be hunky-dory. The officials came to the committee a few weeks ago. Food security, the economy, these are implicit in the mandate, and sometimes these things are actually explicit. So I think that we need to go a little bit further than just making a statement. I feel that collaboration needs to be institutionalized. Mr. Epp mentioned earlier some excellent recommendations in order to institutionalize best practices. There is a cattle association that was here with us earlier. In the first part, Mr. Epp mentioned something, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about the same thing. Mr. Collins, perhaps you can submit your answer in writing. If more than 2 countries have certified a product under trusted global jurisdiction.
Trusted global jurisdiction recognize a product already, then we should provide what they call a provisional registration, jusqu'à ce qu'ils complètent leur analyse.
And do that until they have completed their assessment, but at least the product would be accessible immediately. Another recommendation that Mr. Epp made. The reverse burden of...
Mentionnait comme, par exemple...
You talked about the External Advisory Committee for Seed Regulation. Say we had such a committee, and this committee represented the industry as a whole, saying, here's the problem, but here's also the solution. That could actually become the solution unless the agency demonstrated that there was a risk, a demonstrable risk on health, but then they would actually have the obligation to act on those recommendations. Something else that was mentioned by our own officials. Perhaps high-risk and low-risk products can be separated into different categories in order to make sure that we can expedite the certification for low-risk products and take more time if there is a higher risk to higher risk products. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Mr.
Je commence avec.
Thank you. I'll start with the idea that we can look to what's been made, what decisions have been made in other countries in order to expedite the process in Canada.
It's not that helpful because oftentimes our seed varieties are very focused on local conditions, whereas varieties produced in other areas, even in Michigan or North Dakota, don't perform naturally in Canada. So what's more important is that we think about the culture of the regulatory agencies we have, and that those agencies are encouraged, as you rightly note, to discuss with industry what is important for food security, what is important for economic competitiveness, and that can be a consideration in those decisions. When we think about dicamba that I mentioned, for example, it's not that we need to follow decisions. We need to consider what our farmers need here in Canada and arrive at an outcome, a regulated outcome, that protects both health and safety as well as delivers food security and competitiveness. And if we thought about how we use the products in Canada, at what temperatures, against what weeds, and where the soybeans are in their growth period, we'd arrive at better outcomes. But because our culture is broken, we have a real hard time.
I don't have much time left. I'd like to hear Mr. Northey's thoughts, but I'd also like you to submit them in writing. But not these answers specifically, just your thoughts, further thoughts. You know now what we're aiming for and what we're looking for in order to institutionalize our collaboration and the solutions we're seeking in order to make progress on this mandate of food security without compromising on Canadians' health and safety.
So all these ideas are great, and I think the key to realize is that there will be no one-size-fits-all solution because the range of regulations that impact our sector are very broad. CFI, PMRA, AFC, they all have some regulations that's impacting us. And so the three suggestions. No?
Yeah, it's about 20 seconds over. I apologize. Mr. Perron, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to speak with us. Mr. Northey, I'll be nice and let you finish your sentence, your thought.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say that we can put all these on the table, and to be honest, many of them have been around for a long time, but the reality is, and you mentioned this yourself, it's the action. It's the actual doing it. It's implementing it. It's taking these things and making them concrete across the whole system. So all these options may be great, and others have really great ones as well. But, you know, we've seen so many reports, like I said, for 30 years on this topic. It's about putting them in action.
Cool. Thank you. Ms. Châtel brought something up that was very important. She said that one of the issues is the accumulation of standards and regulatory measures. Sometimes individually they do actually make sense, though. How do you make sure not to remove the ones that are actually important? For example, Mr. Ennis, you talked about dicamba, which is currently being used. If I've understood correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we are re-evaluating a product that was already certified, and then you say, you know, maybe there's a new assessment that says that it might be dangerous for health, that might actually be true. So how do you distinguish one from the other and remove a product too quickly that is necessary for our producers, but also not let them use a product that might be dangerous? We're here, you know, to think out loud. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Question.
Thank you for your question. Indeed, protecting health and safety must be top of mind. But in conclusion, we need to have collaborative solutions in order to allow the usage of a product that respects the health and safety of Canadians. At the same time, we can have food security while also having positive economic impact. In this review process, we can have a collaborative process for the PMRA in order for them to understand the impact of their decisions. We don't have enough information with dicamba, or we have not seen this for other products such as Lambda Psi. And so this is necessary at the PMRA and the CFIA. We can actually make sure that the impact on food security are recognized as important. You can also keep in mind the impact on the industry and make that a priority.
Vous souhaitez qu'on considère les impacts?
I understand that you want the impacts to be taken into consideration, but science evolves and some criteria can change. Mr. Northey, on the same question, I'd like to hear your thoughts when you reassess products that are already being used and you choose to change the authorization to use the product. For example, people from the CFIA certainly were not keen to make those changes. So how do you, how are you discerning about that?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. The key, I think, for us is that the system, so if you take PMRA, for example, the way they assess the products, the science that goes behind it, the high level of standing that PMRA has globally, we don't want to erode that. For many of these situations, it may just be a matter of they have to increase the consultation, they have to increase the sources of data, and then they also have to have the resources to go quicker in their assessment. And in a lot of these cases, when there's a huge delay, it may just be that their caseload or the load of the work they are doing is such that they cannot expedite these particular decisions that are so important for the sector. And so as long as we have transparency, insight, and what we view as the appropriate lens into what the industry needs, and the decision they make, as long as they make it fast and with an understanding of it, and then there's processes to either work through that process to have their decision changed or to apply more data. That's really what we're asking for. But in many cases, it could be just a resourcing issue. It's not necessarily how they're doing it. It's about whether they're getting the proper input and doing it quick enough.
You won't have too much time to answer my next question, but you can provide your answer in writing. This leads me to another subject. Some groups say that certain products should be removed from the market because they've been identified as cancerous in Europe. There's also the other side of the story. There's economic impacts, and if it's used correctly, there is no risk to health. Improving the processes, expediting things without decreasing the quality, would that not allow us in these dubious cases to find replacement products that are less hurtful? Are there new products, for example, that you're waiting to certify within your respective industries? I've already, I've asked some clearer questions in the past.
So we have roughly 12 minutes left. We'll do 5 minutes to the Conservatives, 5 minutes to Liberals, and then we'll finish with Mr. Perron, 2.5 minutes. So I believe I'm going to Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be splitting my time with Mr. Bonk here shortly. So to each of the witnesses, just wanted to ask both of you, Mr. Northey and Mr. Innes, thank you for being here today. Just were each of you and your organizations approached by any of the governmental departments, CFIA, PMRA, or AAFC, for a consultation process regarding the elimination of the burdensome regulations? So were you folks consulted in that? Either one of you, and I guess I can ask the gentleman online as well, Mr. Collins, if you wanted to submit that. Okay, well, obviously, I think if we're going to get to good policy, we're going to need to have good consultations with the key stakeholders whose industries are most impacted. If you were to make recommendations, what would they be? And I ask you to kind of do it as succinctly as possible as to how to best alleviate the choke points or improve the aspect for making Canadian agriculture more competitive across the board. So can you summarize that as quickly as possible?
Yeah, and so just to confirm, you're asking if we were consulted for these reports that were just published in September. Yeah, no, we were not. But I mean, to be fair, we've been consulted many years on these things, every 2 years rest. So I mean, for agriculture, there's an agile regulations table set up by Agriculture Canada. They have 170 distinct regulations that have been identified by the sector. So there's no shortage of massive lists of regulations that impact the sector. Again, I would just point out that it's taking those and actually putting some change into action. And I'll cede time to Brian as well.
When I think about your question, it's not always about the regulation as written. It's about how it is executed. When I just look at the things that I brought to the committee today, all of those things could be solved by the way the agencies execute their mandate. If we look at electronic phytosanitary certification, it's not a regulatory limit, it's a limit of action and willingness to take action. If we look at the seed regulatory modernization and how we can go from days in one organization to literally 2 to 3 months is our experience with CFIA, that timeline could be adjusted through action.
Mr. Riz, can you just follow up that? What do you suggest is the solution to that? Like, I know we've identified the problem. What do you feel is the quickest way to a solution for that?
Clear direction that working to enable food security and economic competitiveness is important for our regulatory agencies.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Mr. Bonk.
Thank you. So, Mr. Northey, you had a very impactful statement at the beginning of your remarks, and you said there's institutional inertia in CFIA and in PMRA. And we know that the Liberals have spent upwards of $80 million in their transformation efforts within PMRA. And I'm just wondering if any of your stakeholders have seen any benefit at all from this.
Yeah, the transformation agenda was a challenging process for sure. We had lots of opportunity. I mean, just to say to sit on the different committees that were involved in it and the working groups and these kinds of things. But ultimately, what came from that agenda was fairly minimal. There was a regulation, but they pulled it back recently, which was a positive development that came out of that. So. I think the effort, I think the overall effort, again, just to reiterate, is everyone identifies the problem we have here, where the agencies have a set of regulations, they're either not performing them well or they're not really working for industry. And so they embarked on that, but that transformation agenda did not bring the impact that we were hoping.
So every one of you today have brought up the need for more collaboration, and you could hear it in Mr. Collins' voice from his organization that there was no collaboration when they're coming up with a lot of these regulations. And would it be possible, maybe, Mr. Ennis, if you could talk about, you always use DECAMBA, for example. Did you feel that there was enough collaboration between your organization and CFIA and PMRA?
Thanks for the question. When we think about implementing food security and competitiveness, it's ultimately about evolving the process to enable it to be more collaborative. The process for a special review is a black box. And what we end up with is a proposed decision after years of behind-the-curtain discussions at the regulatory agency.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Connors, 5 minutes.
Good day, gentlemen. Thanks for coming in. So I know, your organization's been around for a long time, and I think, Greg, you just mentioned that you've been consulted before. Just quickly, how has the regulatory red tape and burden changed over the years? And in your opinion, and I think most of us would agree that there is more than previously. So I think that's already answered. But what is the reason for that? Is it because of the complexity of the issues now, how the industry has changed? And how do you think the role of regulation has changed over the years as well?
Big things we've so yeah, I mean, we've been consulted a lot on regulation. There's always been opportunity to feed into what should change. One of the biggest things I think we're noticing is that the speed of business, the speed of innovation, the way we need to get our product to market, if you're just talking about CFI and phytosanitary certificates, for instance, and how you get a shipment from Saskatchewan or Ontario to your end-use market, the speed is incredible now, and the competition is even higher. And so while before we could generally muddle through and have 10-day service standards for things, or take 410 days to get a novel trait decided upon, we just can't do that anymore. We have many competitors globally, and we're trying to position ourselves in Canada to compete in the world, in our system. And whether it's risk aversion or whether the regulations there's not enough resources to actually implement them from the government side, we're just noticing it more. It just becomes much more problematic. And ultimately what happens is Canadian businesses have to put their own resources. You have to hire 3 more people to deal with the regulatory process to make it go smoother, and it becomes more problematic. And I think that's where the friction is really emerging.
Mr. Innes, did you have anything to add to that? Well,
just to add, our customers' expectations are also changing. So our Japanese customers, when they talk to us and ask us for electronic certification, it's because their business is moving faster as well. They can go on a U.S. government website and scan a QR code and get the documentation, whereas it takes us literally a courier to pick it up from the processing site in rural Canada, to take it to an international place where it can be flown over, which then gets onto another truck and then finally gets to the place where it needs to be in Japan, for example. Whereas it could have happened like that.
Okay. Going back to, you just mentioned the Agile table. Do you think there are ways that can be improved? And I look for your recommendations, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a long process, and I think, just to reiterate, it's been a process to identify the regulatory burden and regulations that need changing. But again, there was early talk about sandboxes, this idea of putting everybody in trying regulations, like unique ways in which, if you're going to regulate something, you allow a environment, at least for a year, to test to see what the impact would be. Like for instance, for protein claims for pulse crops, for pulses, put it in a sandbox. It's not going to damage the individual consumer. What are those looking like? But we've seen nothing from that, right? The ideas were there. The intention was good. We have a giant spreadsheet. We've seen some things that come out of it. We've had certain trials, at least in the pulse sector, and Protein Industries Canada has had some success getting some trials done and that come out of that. But ultimately, it's a very good process. But what is the action?
So do you think that it would benefit the industry if it was followed up on and became something that the industry could implement? Yeah,
I think having a sense from the regulators that we can try and run with this, how we could address this, because we can raise it goes into a regulator, and then we don't know, to Brian's point, what then happens to it, because it goes through then a sort of a risk process, and then what comes at the end of it is often, from a Canadian perspective, not as dynamic as we'd like to see as far as how that regulation should actually look.
Okay. Mr. Collins, any of those questions that I just asked, you can certainly send in your written report.
Perfect. 2.5 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Innes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Innes, let's pick up where we left off. You answered a question from a Conservative colleagues about dicamba. You said that you were not really consulted in the process and you were just kind of, told what the results were. Now there's a question of asking for more documents. Is that not part of the consultation phase. So how do you want this process to go? Do you want this happening at...
De ce que nous voyons de notre perspective, c'est qu'il y a un rôle d'avoir la perspective agricole avant qu'ils font la décision proposée. Parce que maintenant, ils ont fait une décision proposée et maintenant tout le monde répond. Nous répondons aussi des autres personnes qui s'intéressent dans des produits phytosanitaires s'impliquent et ça crée beaucoup de travail.
Apologize. We need to check on translation here. It's not coming through.
Interpretation. The microphone. Hello, everyone. I hope that interpretation is working.
OK.
Yep.
Alors, vous me direz combien...
Let me know how much time I have because my timer...
OK, ça fonctionne.
2.5 minutes, so it wasn't working at all. Mr. Innes, from the top, because there was no interpretation, you answered my conservative colleagues. With regards to dicamba, there was no collaboration and there was no transparency, and the decision was imposed on you. What I'm asking is that they are asking for information, and is that not part of the consultation? If that's not enough, what do you recommend? On to you. Thank you for the question. Here's what we're seeing. The process is that there is a decision that is given after an internal process within the agency. However, these decisions actually have an impact on agricultural practices. We need to have a mechanism in place to see how these discussions are taking place. We need to manage the risk identified by the agency. That's very important when we're talking about food security and competitiveness. If those things are important to the agency, then they can adapt their process in order to include those. Thank you. Earlier, you mentioned when answering, I believe, Ms. Châtel, that it's interesting to see if other countries might have product certification, but it was also important to see if anything was authorized here due to geographics and so on. You think that it's more important to act on the crop than to adopt decisions that have been made elsewhere. I'd like you to elaborate. Thank you. What's important for our farmers is what's happening in their fields. There are international decisions and scientific decisions that are important for the agencies. But for farmers, what's important is what they can produce within their climate safely, with all of their water, their soil, and so on. So it's not that important to collaborate with international agencies. What's important is what's important to our farmers, and therefore local production.
This concludes our meeting. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and Mr. Collins, please feel free to submit any type of document. If you need any assistance, please contact the clerk. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And is there a motion to adjourn? Are we good? Okay. Meeting adjourned.
you.